The wind hit 60 miles per hour on the third night, tearing roofs off cabins and burying doors under 8-foot drifts across the Montana Territory. Inside his woven branch perimeter, Gideon Rousseau watched neighboring cabins collapse, while his snow-packed walls flexed and held, proving what every trapper in the valley had called the most wasteful project they had ever seen. Before we continue, let us know where you are watching from, and if frontier survival stories like this one fascinate you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode reveals an innovation even more unbelievable than this. Isaac Pruitt died on April 23, 1858, buried under 12 feet of snow in a narrow Montana valley. Gideon Rousseau heard the avalanche from a quarter-mile away, a sound like distant thunder that meant something terrible had just happened. He dropped his trap and ran toward the sound, knowing even as he ran that he was probably too late. The spring sun had been warming the snowpack for 3 days, turning stable slopes into death traps. They both knew the danger, but they were checking traps in areas they normally would have avoided because their winter camp had been destroyed. Gideon found the debris field within minutes. Fresh snow, still settling, covered what had been a steep slope. Isaac had been working a trap line near a beaver dam at the base of the valley. The avalanche had come from above, triggered by warming temperatures and the weight of winter's accumulation finally releasing all at once. Gideon began digging with his hands, then with a flat piece of bark, then with Isaac's own shovel that he found half buried at the edge of the slide. He dug for 4 hours, methodically working the area where he thought Isaac had been standing. When he finally found his partner, Isaac had been dead for hours, suffocated under the weight of snow that had hit him like a wall of stone. Gideon buried Isaac on a hillside above the valley, marking the grave with stones he carried up one at a time. He spent that night alone at their spring camp, unable to sleep, replaying the previous 5 months in his mind. They had survived the winter, barely. Their cabin, built the previous fall using standard methods, had failed in January. The roof had partially collapsed under snow weight during a week-long storm. They had spent 3 days in bitter cold, repairing it with frozen hands and diminishing supplies. The failure had forced them to extend their trapping season into dangerous spring conditions because they had burned through too many supplies during the crisis. Isaac had died not because of the avalanche itself, but because their shelter had failed, forcing them into risks they should not have taken. Gideon realized something that night that would consume him for the next year. The cabin failure had nearly killed them both. It had definitely killed Isaac, just not directly. Mountain men accepted that winter was dangerous, that cabins were temporary, that survival meant accepting risks. But Gideon could not accept it. He became obsessed with a single question that most trappers never asked. Why did some structures survive winter while others failed? And what could be done differently to change those odds? Gideon spent the summer of 1858 traveling to every abandoned or damaged cabin within 50 miles of his trapping territory. He was not trapping, he was studying failure. Most mountain men would have returned to work immediately, replacing lost income from the disastrous spring. Gideon instead invested his remaining money in a horse and supplies for travel, determined to understand what had killed his partner. Other trappers thought he had lost his mind to grief. He had lost something, but it was not his mind. It was his willingness to accept that cabin failures were inevitable acts of nature rather than solvable engineering problems. He found 17 cabins that had been damaged or destroyed during the previous winter. Each one told a story. Some had roofs collapsed under snow weight. The logs and poles snapped like kindling under thousands of pounds of accumulated snowpack. Some had walls blown apart by wind, the chinking torn out, and the logs shifted until gaps appeared that let in killing cold. Some had doors buried under drifts so massive that the occupants would have been trapped inside, slowly suffocating as their fires consumed the available oxygen. 3 cabins had been abandoned midwinter. their occupants fleeing to uncertain fate rather than staying in structures that had become death traps. Gideon documented everything. He measured snow accumulation patterns around each failed cabin. He noted which directions wind had come from based on damage patterns and drift shapes. He examined how different cabin designs had failed under similar conditions. But more importantly, he began studying what had not failed. Natural windbreaks created by tree lines showed dramatically different snow accumulation than open areas. Dense spruce groves had minimal snow on their leeward side, while open meadows had drifts 15 feet high. Rock formations created wind shadows where snow depth was half what it was 50 yards away in exposed terrain. He noticed that flexible trees survived storms that snapped rigid dead-standing timber. Young aspens bent nearly horizontal under wind and snow, then straightened when conditions improved. Old growth pines with rigid trunks broke at weak points, crashing down across clearings. The lesson seemed clear. Flexibility survived. Rigidity failed. But how could that principle apply to cabins? A flexible cabin made no sense. The logs had to be solid and rigid to support weight and maintain structural integrity. The answer came to Gideon in late July while he was examining an old beaver dam. The dam itself was a woven structure, branches and logs interlaced and packed with mud and vegetation. It was permeable enough to let some water through, preventing the pressure that would destroy a solid barrier, but dense enough to create a pond. The beavers had not built a solid wall. They had built a composite structure that used multiple materials working together, each serving a specific purpose. Gideon stared at that dam for an hour, understanding forming slowly. What if a cabin's first line of defense was not the cabin itself? What if you built something that managed wind and snow before they ever reached your actual shelter? Gideon returned to his trapping territory in late August 1858 with supplies that confused every trapper who saw them. He had no extra logs for building a new cabin. He had no additional tools for standard construction. What he did have was 3 coils of rawhide cord, a specialized bark stripping tool he had purchased from a craftsman in Fort Benton, 4 dozen iron stakes forged to his specifications, and a detailed plan that made sense to nobody but himself. When Rufus Blackwell stopped by to see what Gideon was planning for winter, he found his neighbor cutting willow saplings along the creek, stripping them of bark, and bundling them in organized piles according to length and thickness. Rufus watched for 20 minutes before asking what purpose willow saplings served in cabin construction. Gideon explained that he was not building a cabin yet. He was building a perimeter fence first. Rufus asked what he needed to fence in, given that he had no livestock and was not farming. Gideon said the fence was not for keeping anything in. It was for managing wind and snow. Rufus stared at the pile of stripped saplings, shook his head, and told Gideon that grief had clearly damaged his thinking. A fence would not stop wind. A fence would not stop snow. Building one before building shelter was backwards and stupid. Gideon thanked Rufus for his concern and continued stripping bark. Over the next 2 weeks, Gideon cut and prepared over 400 willow saplings, selecting only those between 6 and 8 feet in length and 1 to 2 inches in diameter at the base. He rejected any with excessive taper or irregular curves. He stripped every single one completely, a process that took hours per bundle. The bark had to come off because bark was irregular and would prevent tight weaving. The saplings had to be uniform because inconsistent materials would create weak points in the structure he was envisioning. When he had enough saplings prepared, he selected a new cabin site on elevated ground with good drainage and clear sight lines in all directions. Then he began the work that made him a subject of mockery throughout the scattered trapping community. He drove his iron stakes in a circle 30 feet from where his cabin would eventually stand. The stakes were 3 feet long, driven 2 feet into the ground using a heavy wooden mallet. He placed them 6 feet apart, creating a perimeter that enclosed nearly 3,000 square feet. The work The took 3 days. When Barnabas Kemp arrived and saw the circle of stakes, he asked if Gideon was building a pen for invisible livestock. Gideon said he was building a windbreak. Barnabas pointed out that there was nothing between the stakes to break wind. Gideon agreed and began weaving. He started at ground level, taking a long willow sapling and weaving it horizontally between the stakes, wrapping it around each one in an over-under pattern that basket makers had used for centuries. When the sapling ended, he overlapped the next one and continued weaving. The first row took an entire day to complete around the full perimeter. Then he started the second row, offset from the first to create a true woven pattern. Then the third row, then the fourth. The structure grew slowly upward, a basket fence that served no purpose anyone could understand. Otto Lindgren arrived at Gideon's camp on September 15, 1858, accompanied by 2 other trappers who had heard about the strange fence and wanted to see it for themselves. By that point, Gideon's woven wall stood 4 feet high and encircled his entire building site in a continuous barrier of interlaced willow. The saplings had been woven so tightly that you could barely see through the structure, yet it was obviously permeable. Wind passed through it, light passed through it. It would clearly stop nothing. Otto walked the perimeter slowly, examining the weave, testing the flexibility by pushing against it. The structure gave slightly under pressure, but did not break. He turned to Gideon and asked what exactly this fence was supposed to accomplish. Gideon had explained his reasoning to several visitors already, but nobody had understood or believed him. He tried again anyway. The wall would trap snow, he told them. When winter came and snow began falling, the flakes would catch in the woven saplings. The permeable structure would slow wind without stopping it completely, creating turbulence that would deposit snow into the weave itself. As snow accumulated in the framework, it would pack and freeze, turning the flexible willow structure into a rigid barrier of ice and compressed snow. The wooden framework was not the actual windbreak. It was a skeleton that would hold the real windbreak, which would be snow itself. Otto considered this explanation and identified what he saw as the fatal flaw. If Gideon was using snow to protect himself from snow, then he was relying on the very thing that killed people to keep him alive. That made no sense. Snow-buried cabins, snow-collapsed roofs, snow-created drifts that trapped people inside structures until they suffocated or froze. Using snow as a building material was not innovation. It was suicide. Gideon tried to explain the difference between controlled snow accumulation and chaotic drifting, between a perimeter barrier that managed where snow went and a cabin that simply endured whatever nature delivered. Otto was unconvinced. He told Gideon directly that this was the dumbest thing he had ever seen a trapper attempt. The second trapper pointed out another obvious problem. The wall was permeable, which meant wind would blow through it. A solid log wall would actually stop wind. A woven willow fence would not. Even if snow filled the gaps, the first strong wind would blow that snow right back out. Gideon explained that solid barriers created turbulent vortices on the leeward side that actually made snow accumulation worse. Solid barriers also caught wind like sails, creating tremendous force that could tear structures apart. A permeable barrier would let some wind through, reducing that force while still providing protection. The third trapper asked how long this fence had taken to build. Gideon admitted he had been working for 3 weeks and expected another 3 weeks to reach his target height of 5 feet. 6 weeks total for a fence. The trapper pointed out that a complete cabin could be built in 4 days. Gideon was spending more time on a fence than most men spent on their entire winter shelter. That was wasteful and would probably kill him when winter came. Gideon worked alone through September and October of 1858, and the isolation was deliberate. Visitors had stopped coming after word spread that Rousseau the basket weaver had lost his mind to grief and was building a fence that would accomplish nothing. He did not mind the solitude. It allowed him to focus on details that required constant attention and adjustment. The weaving itself was meditative work, repetitive but demanding precision. Each sapling had to be positioned correctly, woven tightly enough to create minimal gaps, but not so tightly that the structure became rigid. He was building flexibility into every foot of the wall, knowing that winter winds would test whether his engineering was sound or fatally flawed. By early October, the wall had reached 5 feet in height around the entire perimeter. Gideon then began adding what he considered the most critical feature, though it made the structure look even more absurd to anyone who saw it. He wove sections with different densities, creating zones where the gaps between saplings varied from tight to loose. The sections were each 10 feet long, alternating around the circle. His reasoning was experimental. He did not know which weave density would work best for trapping and holding snow. Tight weaves might catch snow efficiently, but create too much wind resistance. Loose weaves might allow too much wind through and fail to accumulate enough snow. By building different densities, he could observe which performed best and adjust future construction accordingly. He also reinforced the structure in ways that were invisible from outside. Every 6 feet, he added vertical support stakes driven deep into the ground and woven into the horizontal pattern. These supports would prevent the wall from sagging under the weight of accumulated snow. At the corners where his circular perimeter had slight angles, he doubled the stakes and added extra horizontal layers, creating reinforced sections that would handle stress concentration. The work was obsessive in its detail. Gideon tested every connection, tugged every overlap, examined every potential weak point. He was building something that had never been built before, which meant he could not rely on proven techniques. Every decision was a calculated guess based on principles he had observed in natural structures. The total construction time reached 8 weeks by the time Gideon declared the wall complete in late October. A standard mountain cabin required 4 days with 2 men working. Gideon had invested 12 times that duration on a structure that was not even his shelter. Inside the perimeter, he then built his actual cabin using conventional methods. The cabin itself was nothing special, just solid basic construction with carefully fitted logs and a sturdy roof. He was not trying to reinvent cabin building. He was trying to protect cabins from the forces that destroyed them. The cabin took him 9 days to complete, working alone. Barnabas Kemp rode past in mid-November and stopped briefly. He did not dismount. He simply sat on his horse, looked at the woven perimeter wall surrounding Gideon's modest cabin, and shook his head. He told Gideon that he had wasted months on a fence that would be useless by January. Then he rode off. Gideon felt no need to argue. Winter would provide the proof that words could not. The first snow came on November 8, 1858, earlier than normal for the Montana Territory. Gideon woke to find 2 inches of fresh powder covering everything, and he immediately went outside to examine his wall. The snow had begun doing exactly what he had predicted. The flakes had caught in the woven saplings, accumulating in the horizontal layers like cotton filling a basket. The permeable structure had allowed wind to pass through, but it reduced speed, creating the turbulence necessary to deposit snow rather than carry it away. He walked the entire perimeter, studying how different weave densities were performing. The tighter sections had caught more snow. The looser sections had caught less, but seemed more stable. By midday, the sun had emerged and temperatures had risen slightly. Gideon watched the trapped snow begin to compact under its own weight and partial melting. As afternoon temperatures dropped again, the moisture froze, binding the snow crystals together into a denser mass. The snow was not just sitting in his wall, it was becoming part of the wall, fusing with the willow framework to create a composite structure. He pressed his hand against a section. It felt solid, almost like packed earth. This was the transformation he had envisioned, but had not been certain would actually occur. 3 days later, a second snowfall added 4 more inches. The wall grew visibly thicker and more substantial. Snow that had been loose and powdery was now compressed and frozen solid between the saplings. The structure had transformed from a see-through woven fence into what appeared to be a solid white barrier 5 feet high. Gideon could no longer see through it. Wind that approached from any direction hit the wall first and lost velocity before reaching his cabin. He began noticing the microclimate effect immediately. Inside his perimeter, wind speed was noticeably reduced. Snow that fell inside the protected zone accumulated evenly and shallowly. Outside the wall, wind was already creating irregular drifts. On November 20th, the first significant storm arrived, bringing 8 inches of new snow and sustained winds of 25 miles per hour. Gideon stayed inside his cabin during the worst of it, but he could hear the wind roaring outside. The sound was different than he remembered from previous winters. The wind was hitting something before it reached his cabin walls. When the storm cleared, he went outside and found his wall had gained another foot of height from wind-blown snow packing into the upper sections. The structure had not been damaged. It had been strengthened. Rufus Blackwell stopped by a week later, curious to see whether the wall had survived. He admitted it looked more substantial than he had expected. Gideon offered to explain the engineering principles, but Rufus declined. He said it seemed like a lot of work for what amounted to a fancy snow fence, and he was not convinced it would matter when real winter arrived. Gideon did not argue. December and January would bring normal winter conditions. February would bring the test that neither man could predict was coming. December 1858 through January 1859 brought what trappers considered normal winter conditions for Montana Territory. Temperatures dropped to 10 below zero on cold nights and rose to 20 above during sunny afternoons. Snow fell steadily, but not dramatically, adding 2 to 4 inches every few days. Gideon's wall performed exactly as he had designed it to perform, which meant it worked well, but not spectacularly. The snow continued accumulating in the woven framework, building the barrier thicker and more solid with each snowfall. Wind continued depositing additional snow on the windward side, which packed and froze, reinforcing the structure. Inside the perimeter, conditions were noticeably calmer than outside, but the difference was not dramatic enough to convince skeptics that the effort had been worthwhile. Other trappers saw Gideon's setup during their winter travels and had mixed reactions. Some acknowledged that his wall seemed functional and that the protected zone around his cabin showed less snow accumulation than surrounding areas. Others attributed the benefits to location or luck rather than design. The general consensus among the scattered trapping community was that Gideon had built something that worked adequately but had required far too much effort for marginal improvement. A well-built cabin in a good location would have provided similar protection with a fraction of the construction time. Gideon did not argue with these assessments. He simply continued his winter routine of checking trap lines and processing pelts. Ephraim Dodge visited in mid-January, traveling through the area on his way to Fort Benton with furs to sell. He spent an afternoon examining Gideon's wall with genuine curiosity rather than mockery. Ephraim was older than most trappers, 47 years old, and had survived more winters than any man Gideon knew. He walked the perimeter slowly, studying how the snow had integrated with the willow framework. He asked detailed questions about weave patterns, stake placement, and the reasoning behind the circular design. Gideon explained everything, including the physics of wind reduction, drift management, and microclimate creation. The wall reduced wind speed by approximately half before it reached the cabin. It prevented chaotic drifting that could bury doors or pile against walls. It created a buffer zone where temperature was slightly higher than the surrounding area because wind chill was reduced. Ephraim listened carefully and admitted the engineering made sense. He also pointed out what Gideon already knew. It seemed like tremendous work for what amounted to making winter slightly more comfortable. Most trappers would not invest 2 months of construction time for marginal improvements in wind protection. Gideon agreed but said he was not trying to make winter comfortable. He was trying to survive the kind of winter that killed people, the kind that came without warning and destroyed structures that had seemed adequate. Ephraim asked if Gideon expected such a winter. Gideon said he had no idea, but if it came, he wanted to be ready. Ephraim left the next morning, unconvinced that the wall justified its cost, but respectful of the thought behind it. January continued with steady cold and moderate snowfall. February began the same way. Then, on February 12th, the weather changed. February 12, 1859 began with clear skies and unusual warmth. The temperature reached 25 degrees by mid-morning, warm enough that Gideon opened his cabin door to air out the interior. By noon, the sky had changed. A flat gray ceiling of clouds moved in from the northwest, bringing the kind of atmospheric pressure that made experienced mountain men nervous. Gideon checked his firewood supply, confirmed his water stores, and prepared food that would not require leaving the cabin. He had learned to read weather signs during his years in the mountains. What was coming would be significant. The snow started at 3 in the afternoon, light flakes that seemed harmless. By sunset, the wind had begun. By 8 that evening, the wind was howling at sustained speeds Gideon had never experienced. He estimated 30 miles per hour, then 40, then higher. The snow was no longer falling vertically, but driving horizontally, creating complete whiteout conditions. Gideon stayed inside his cabin, listening to the roar of wind hitting his perimeter wall. The sound was like constant thunder, a deep vibration that shook the air but did not shake his cabin walls. The wall was taking the impact. His cabin sat in relative calm behind the barrier. The temperature dropped through the night. By morning of February 13th, it had reached 30 below zero. The combination of extreme cold and high wind created conditions that would kill an exposed person in minutes. Gideon could not see beyond his own door. The whiteout was total. He stayed inside, maintaining his fire, rationing his supplies, and listening to the storm. On the second night he heard a massive crack in the distance, the sound of wood breaking under extreme stress. Something structural had failed somewhere. He had no way to know what or where. On the third morning he heard another crash, closer this time, then another in the afternoon. The wind reached its peak on the third night, February 14th. Gideon estimated speeds of 50 to 60 miles per hour, based on the sound and the way his cabin occasionally shuddered, despite the wall's protection. He went to his small window and looked out into darkness and blowing snow. He could see his wall, barely visible in the storm, flexing under wind pressure but holding. The woven structure was bending, absorbing force rather than resisting it rigidly. Snow was plastering the windward side in thick layers, adding weight but also adding strength. The composite of willow and frozen snow was performing exactly as he had designed it to perform. February 15th brought slightly reduced wind but continued snow. February 16th, the fourth day, the wind finally stopped. The sudden silence was startling. Gideon waited until full daylight before opening his door. The door opened easily. His perimeter wall had prevented drifts from burying his entrance. He could walk out of his cabin without digging, which meant he was not trapped. He climbed to the top of his wall, using the packed snow as stairs, and looked at what the blizzard had done to the valley. What he saw made him understand that his wall had not just protected him, it had saved his life. The devastation was total. From his elevated position atop his snow wall, Gideon could see 3 neighboring cabins within a mile. Rufus Blackwell's cabin had no roof. The entire structure was visible as a hollow square of walls open to the sky. The roof beams snapped and scattered across 50 yards of snow. Barnabas Kemp's cabin had lost its entire north wall. Gideon could see inside the structure from his vantage point, furniture and supplies scattered, everything exposed to the elements. Otto Lindgren's cabin was completely buried except for the chimney, a thin column of stone protruding from an 8-foot drift. Smoke was not rising from it, which meant either the fire was out or Otto was not inside. Gideon climbed down and began the work of checking on his neighbors. The snow outside his protected perimeter was waist-deep in most places and chest-deep where drifts had formed. Travel was exhausting. He reached Rufus Blackwell's destroyed cabin first and found it abandoned. Tracks led away toward the south, toward another trapper's camp 3 miles distant. Rufus had survived and fled. Gideon followed the back trail and found evidence that Rufus had left on the second day of the storm, which meant he had walked 3 miles in blizzard conditions. That he had survived at all was remarkable. Barnabas Kemp's cabin was next. Gideon found Barnabas inside, alive but in poor condition. The north wall had blown in on the second night, and Barnabas had survived by retreating to the opposite corner and piling everything he owned against the remaining walls to create a windbreak. He had burned his furniture to maintain heat. When Gideon arrived, Barnabas was huddled under every blanket he possessed, shivering despite the fire. Gideon helped him to his feet and offered to bring him back to his own cabin. Barnabas looked at Gideon and asked how his cabin had survived. Gideon told him the cabin had been fine. The wall had protected it. Barnabas said nothing, but his expression showed that mockery had transformed into something else. Otto Lindgren's buried cabin required 2 hours of digging before Gideon could reach the door. He found Otto inside, alive but trapped. The drift had covered his door completely, and Otto had been burning green wood to create smoke signals, hoping someone would see his chimney. He had food and water, but had been slowly suffocating as his fire consumed oxygen from the sealed structure. Gideon dug a tunnel to the door and pulled it open. Fresh air rushed in. Otto sat on his floor, breathing deeply, and stared at Gideon. He asked how Gideon had gotten to him so easily. Gideon explained that his door had not been buried because his wall had managed the drifts. Otto asked if the wall was still standing. Gideon confirmed it was not only standing, but had been strengthened by the storm. Ephraim Dodge's cabin was intact but inaccessible. His door was buried under a drift that would take days to clear. Smoke rose from his chimney, indicating he was alive inside but trapped. Gideon spent the rest of February 16th and all of February 17th helping neighbors dig out, repair, and survive. Spring 1859 brought conversations that changed frontier construction across the northern Rockies. Trappers who had survived the blizzard of '59 gathered at trading posts and camps, sharing stories of damage and loss. 4 men had died in the storm, frozen in cabins that failed or caught in the open trying to reach shelter. Dozens of structures had been destroyed or damaged beyond repair. The financial cost was devastating for men who survived on narrow margins. But the conversations kept returning to one detail that seemed impossible. Gideon Rousseau's ridiculous woven fence had not only survived but had protected his entire homestead so effectively that he had walked out of the storm without digging and had been the first person able to help others. By late April, trappers began appearing at Gideon's camp asking questions. How had he known to build the wall? What was the weaving pattern? How deep did the stakes need to be driven? Where did you harvest the willow? How long did construction take? Gideon answered every question and offered to teach anyone who wanted to learn. He was not trying to profit from his innovation. He was trying to ensure that fewer men died in the next catastrophic storm. Over the summer of 1859, he helped 3 neighboring trappers build their own perimeter walls, teaching them the technique he had developed through observation and experimentation. The method spread organically. Men who had seen Gideon's wall described it to others. Trappers who had survived the blizzard in standard cabins decided that 2 months of construction time was worth the protection. By fall 1859, 6 homesteads in the region had woven snow walls. By 1862, the technique had spread throughout northern Montana and into Wyoming territory. It became known by different names in different areas. Some called it Rousseau fencing, Others called it basket walls or woven windbreaks. The specific terminology mattered less than the principle. A permeable perimeter barrier that managed wind and snow before they reached your shelter could mean the difference between survival and death in extreme conditions. Gideon continued trapping until 1867, when declining fur prices and age made the work unsustainable. He sold his Montana claim to a younger trapper who maintained the woven wall and added improvements based on 9 winters of observation. Gideon moved to Oregon Territory, bought a small farm, and lived quietly. He married in 1869 and had 2 daughters who never knew their father had been a mountain man. He died in 1881 at 59 years old, buried in a cemetery outside Salem. His gravestone listed him as a farmer. No mention was made of innovations or survival techniques, but in the mountains his legacy persisted. Into the 1870s and 1880s, homesteaders and trappers continued building woven perimeter walls, adapting the technique to local materials and conditions. The impossible had become routine. Winter's weapon had been turned into winter's defense through observation, engineering, and the willingness to build something that looked ridiculous until the moment it saved your life. That lesson, carved into willow and frozen snow, lasted far longer than the man who discovered it.